What happens when your sworn enemy appears on your doorstep, broken and helpless? For Abigail Thorne, a widow living on the desolate edge of the Arizona Territory, that question became terrifyingly real one stormy night. She found an Apache raider, the very kind of man who likely made her a widow paralyzed and dying in the mud. Her conscience demanded she save him, but her secret act of mercy would ignite a firestorm of fear and prejudice in her small town. They would discover her secret, and to punish her, they would force her into an unholy union, binding her in marriage to the man she saved. This is the story of a choice that cost a woman her freedom, but might just have saved her soul. The sky over the Arizona Territory had been a bleached, unforgiving canvas for months, but on that late October evening, it had bruised to a violent purple. Abigail Thorne watched from the single window of her small cabin, her hand resting on the cool, worn wood of the sill her husband William had planned smooth. The wind, a low, moaning thing for days, had finally found its voice, shrieking through the crags of the Dragoon Mountains and whipping the rain into horizontal needles that stung the glass. It had been a year since William had been laid to rest in the small, wind-swept cemetery behind the Cinder Creek Chapel. A fever, Doc Hemlock had said, though Abigail knew in her heart the relentless work and the gnawing worry of this land had hollowed him out long before the sickness took hold. Now she was alone. The cabin, once a haven of shared dreams, felt like a ship adrift in a hostile sea. Its 2 rooms were her entire world, a world of scent, wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faint, lingering smell of William's pipe tobacco that she couldn't bring herself to wash from his woolen coat. The land around her was hers, 160 acres of grit and scrub that William had poured his life into. But without him, it was just a target for the elements, for predators, and for the whispers of men like Corbin Finch in town, who looked at a widow's property the way a vulture looks at a dying calf. A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the tormented dance of the mesquite trees for a blinding second. In its wake, a boom of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin. The milk cow in the small attached lean-to bellowed in protest. Abigail murmured a soft reassurance, though the sound was swallowed by the storm's fury. She turned from the window, her reflection a pale, weary ghost in the glass, and began to light the lanterns. The familiar ritual of securing her home against the night was a comfort, a small act of defiance against the vast, chaotic wilderness outside. She had just finished barring the heavy plank door when she heard it. It wasn't the wind or the rain or the frantic skittering of some small creature. It was a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural groan, almost lost in a gust of wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her first thought was a cougar, wounded and dangerous. She reached for the rifle mounted above the hearth, its stock smooth and familiar in her hands. William had taught her to shoot his patient hands guiding hers. "You don't point and hope, Abby," he'd said. "You become the still point in the middle of the world." She waited, her breath held tight in her chest, the rifle's cold weight a grim comfort. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a wet, dragging noise. It was human. A prospector may be caught in the flash flood brewing in the arroyo, or a traveler whose horse had thrown him. Abigail crept to the window, peering through a small section she'd wiped clean of condensation. The rain was a thick, blurring curtain, but another flash of lightning provided a macabre tableau. There, not 20 feet from her door, was the source of the sound. A man crawling. He was pulling his body through the sucking mud, with his arms, his legs dragging uselessly behind him. He was Apache. Ice flooded her veins. His hair was long and black, plastered to his skull by the rain. His buckskin clothing was torn and stained dark with mud, and something else she knew was blood. He wore the markings of a raider. She had seen them before, in the terrible aftermath of the attack on the Benson homestead, 2 summers ago. The same men who had likely put the arrow in the flank of her best mule last spring. The same kind of men who roamed this land, believing it was still theirs, seeing settlers like her and William as invaders to be driven out or destroyed. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to douse the lamps, to pretend she hadn't seen. He was the enemy. He was the shadow that haunted the edges of their lives, the reason men rode with rifles across their saddles just to visit a neighbor. Helping him would be a betrayal of William, of everyone in Cinder Creek. They would call her a traitor. Or worse. He collapsed his face, pressing into the mud. He didn't move. The rain hammered down on his still form, washing the blood from a wicked gash on his scalp into the red earth. Was he dead? She watched for a long, agonizing minute. Then she saw a slight tremor in his shoulder, a last desperate fight for life. A war raged within her. The pragmatic settler, the grieving widow, the frightened, lonely woman, they all cried out for self-preservation. But there was another voice, the one her mother had instilled in her, the voice that spoke of a shared humanity, that transcended war paint and skin color. It was the voice that had guided her hands as she'd set the leg of a stray dog and nursed a feverish child from a passing wagon train. It was a healer's instinct, a stubborn refusal to let a life, any life, be extinguished when she had the power to prevent it. He was a man, bleeding, broken, and drowning in the mud at her door. To leave him there was to kill him, as surely as if she had pulled the trigger herself. With a sob of frustration and fear, Abigail unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the cabin wall. Rain and cold air rushed in, extinguishing one of the lanterns and sending papers scattering from her small writing desk. She ignored it all. Gritting her teeth against the gale, she stepped out into the maelstrom. Her thin nightdress instantly soaked her bare feet, sinking into the cold, grasping mud. He was heavier than he looked, all wiry muscle and bone. With strength born of desperation, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag him out of the storm and into the fragile sanctuary of her home. The man was a dead weight, a sodden bundle of humanity that smelled of wet leather blood and the metallic tang of the storm. It took every ounce of Abigail's strength to haul him over the threshold and onto the rough-hewn floorboards. She slammed the door against the wind and dropped the bar into place, her lungs heaving, her body trembling from exertion and the icy shock of the rain. For a moment, she simply leaned against the door, the silence of the cabin broken only by her ragged breathing and the storm's distant rage. On her floor lay the embodiment of her deepest fears. His eyes were closed, his face slack a mask of unconsciousness drawn over features that were sharp and angular, sculpted by a life she could only imagine. A prominent hawk-like nose, high cheekbones, and a firm jawline were visible beneath the grime and blood. A deep, jagged wound ran from his temple into his hairline, still sluggishly oozing blood. Pushing aside the tremor in her hands, she moved into action. First light. She relit the extinguished lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. Then warmth. She stoked the embers in the hearth, adding logs until a proper fire crackled to life, casting flickering light on the still figure. She needed to get the wet clothes off him. Her hands hesitated for a fraction of a second as she reached for the lacings of his buckskin shirt. This was an intimacy she hadn't shared with anyone but William, and to perform it now on an enemy, a stranger, felt like a profound violation. but the alternative was letting the chill seep into his bones and kill him. Practicality won over propriety. His skin was cold to the touch. The buckskins were heavy and stiff with water. As she worked, she uncovered a canvas of old scars and new injuries. A puckered white line ran across his ribs, the ghost of an old knife wound. Bruises dark and violent mottled his torso. But it was when she cut away his leggings that she saw the true extent of the damage. His back from the waist down was a horrifying tapestry of angry swollen tissue. At the base of his spine was a grotesque, deep purple swelling. It was clear he hadn't been shot or stabbed there. He must have fallen or been thrown from a great height. A horse, most likely during the violent storm. When she tried to gently shift his legs, they remained utterly limp, unresponsive. He was paralyzed. The realization landed in her gut like a stone. He was not a raider lying in wait, feigning injury. He was utterly, terrifyingly helpless. This changed everything. The immediate threat was gone, replaced by a terrible, long-term problem. Working with a detached efficiency she didn't know she possessed, she cleaned his wounds. She stitched the gash on his head with a fine needle, and thread she normally used for mending her movements, precise and steady. She brewed a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding and crushed willow bark for the fever she knew would come. As she tended to him, she saw the man beneath the warrior. His hands, though calloused, were well formed. A small, intricately beaded amulet hung on a leather thong around his neck, tucked inside his shirt. A personal item. A connection to a life, a family, a world away from this cabin. She managed to roll him onto a spare cot in the corner, covering him with a heavy wool blanket. She spent the rest of the night watching him sitting in her rocking chair with the rifle across her lap, caught between the roles of nurse and jailer. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered murmurs a language she didn't understand, his dark eyes occasionally opening, clouded with pain and confusion, before sliding shut again. In those brief moments of lucidity, his gaze would fix on her, not with hatred, but with a wild, cornered animal's wariness. He knew where he was. He knew who she was. And he knew he was powerless. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, and a silent, feverish battle was fought within the cabin. Abigail forced broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She kept his brow cool with damp cloths and tended to his wounds. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, the way one might speak to a frightened horse, not because she thought he understood the words, but because she hoped he would understand the intent. "You're safe for now," she'd murmur, cleaning a wound. "Just rest. The fever needs to break." He never spoke a word. He watched her. His eyes, dark and intelligent, followed her every move. He watched her cook her meager meals, mend her clothes, and read from her worn Bible by the firelight. There was a fierce pride in that gaze, a refusal to show fear or weakness, even in his broken state. But she also saw flickers of something else, confusion, suspicion, and a grudging awareness of his complete dependence on her. A silent covenant was being forged between them, a fragile truce born of necessity. She was his survival. He was her terrible secret. On the 4th morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight, weak but hopeful, streamed through the window. She awoke in the rocking chair to find him awake, his eyes clear for the first time. The fever had broken. His gaze was fixed on her, sharp and assessing. She rose and brought him a cup of water, holding it to his lips. He drank, his eyes never leaving hers. "Can you understand me?" she asked softly. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My name is Abigail Thorne," she said, though she didn't know why. He remained silent, his expression unreadable. She gestured toward his legs, her face etched with a question she didn't know how to ask. He understood immediately. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of raw despair, so profound it made her ache. He stared at the blanket covering the lower half of his body as if it were a shroud. He knew. He had known since the moment he'd tried to stand after the fall. The silence that followed was heavy with all the things they could not say. He was a warrior rendered inert, a man of action, now a prisoner in his own body. And she, a widow who had lost her world, was now the sole keeper of another. She had saved his life, but what kind of life had she saved him for? And in doing so, what had she done to her own? The sun was shining, but the real storm she feared was only just beginning to gather. With the end of the storm came the inevitable return of the world. Abigail knew her isolation was temporary. Sooner or later, someone from Cinder Creek would ride out to check on the widow Thorne. Her stomach twisted at the thought. How could she possibly explain the man on the cot in her corner? She named him Cale in her own mind. It was a name she'd read once, in a book of old tales, a name that felt solid and strong, a stark contrast to his current state. He was healing at least from his surface wounds. The gash on his head was closing cleanly, and the color was returning to his face. But the stillness of his lower body was a constant grim reminder of his predicament. They developed a silent routine. She would help him with his needs, a process that was deeply humiliating for them both. She would avert her eyes, her movements swift and clinical, while a muscle ticked in his jaw, the only outward sign of his mortification. She would feed him the simple stews and breads that she ate, and he would accept them without expression. The tension in the cabin was a palpable thing, a third presence in the room. His pride warred with his helplessness, her compassion with her fear. His eyes were his only voice. They burned with an intensity that unsettled her. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would see him staring at his own legs with a look of such fury and grief that she had to turn away. He never made a sound of complaint, a silence that was more profound than any cry. It was a week after the storm when she saw the rider approaching. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was Corbin Finch. "Get down!" she hissed at Cale, her voice sharp with panic. "On the floor, now!" He didn't understand the words, but he understood the terror in her tone. With a grunt of effort, he used his powerful arms to slide himself off the cot and onto the floor, pulling the coarse blanket over himself. Abigail quickly threw a patchwork quilt over the empty cot, arranging it to look like a pile of laundry. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and forced a placid expression onto her face before opening the door. Corbin Finch sat atop a fine black gelding, a stark contrast to the work-worn mules of most settlers. He was a man in his late 40s with a narrow face, small, shrewd eyes, and a mouth that was perpetually turned down at the corners, as if he were constantly tasting something sour. He owned the town's mercantile, and a good portion of the land surrounding it, acquiring it piece by piece, often from families struck by misfortune. He was a church elder, his public piety, a thin veneer over a core of cold ambition. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was oily smooth. "We were concerned. A terrible storm. I thought it my Christian duty to check on your welfare. I managed Mr. Finch. Thank you for your concern." Abigail replied, her voice tighter than she wanted. She stood framed in the doorway, making no move to invite him in. His eyes scanned the clearing, noting the freshly repaired section of fence, the full water barrel. "You are a remarkably resourceful woman, Abigail. It cannot be easy all alone out here." He let the words hang in the air. This is no place for a woman on her own. It's a hard land, a dangerous land. My William made it a home. I intend to keep it that way." Finch's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. But sentiment, however noble, does not fill a pantry or guard against predators." His gaze flickered past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "I heard a rumor the Apache were raiding near the San Pedro just before the storm hit. You haven't seen any signs?" Abigail's blood ran cold. She kept her face a mask of neutrality. "I've seen nothing but rain and mud, Mr. Finch." He swung himself down from his horse, his boots making soft thuds in the damp earth. He walked closer, forcing her to step back into the cabin. He sniffed the air. "I smell yarrow. And something else. Antiseptic." He took a step inside his eyes, sweeping the small room. "Have you had an accident, Mrs. Thorne?" "I cut myself mending the fence." She lied, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It's nothing." His gaze fell upon the cot where the quilt was draped. From beneath it, a small corner of the dark wool blanket she'd used to cover Kyle was visible. Finch's eyes narrowed. Before Abigail could react, he strode over and hooked a finger under the quilt, lifting it. The cot was empty. Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But Finch was not deterred. He looked down. Tucked near the leg of the cot, almost invisible in the shadows, was a single dark moccasin that must have come off when she dragged him inside. It was beaded in a pattern she had not noticed before. Finch bent down and picked it up, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a venomous snake. He turned it over, his expression hardening into one of triumphant malice. "What is this, Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. I found it in the arroyo," she stammered, her mind racing. "Washed down by the storm." He laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Did you now? How fortunate. And the smell of herbs and the rifle you keep by the door instead of on the mantel." "You are a poor liar, Abigail." He took another step closer. His presence filling the small cabin, making it feel claustrophobic and unsafe. "You are harboring one of them, a filthy, godless savage, here, on land consecrated by the sweat of a good Christian man." "You don't know anything," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I know what I see. And I know what the good people of Cinder Creek will think when I tell them." He dangled the moccasin in front of her. "They will see a woman who has betrayed her own kind, a woman who gives aid and comfort to the devil's spawn, who murder our children and steal our livestock. They will not be understanding." He paused, letting the threat settle. "However," he continued, his tone shifting, "perhaps this unfortunate situation could be managed. Your land, it is a heavy burden for you. I would be willing to take it off your hands, for a fair price, of course, to help a widow in her time of trouble. You and your guest could be gone by morning. No one need ever know." The choice was laid bare, her home or her secret. To give in to him would be to lose everything William had worked for. It would be to let this vulture pick the bones of their life clean. Abigail lifted her chin, a spark of anger burning through her fear. "This is my land, Mr. Finch. It is not for sale." His face darkened. "You are a fool, woman." He tossed the moccasin onto the floor. "You have made your choice, and you will find that the Lord's flock is not kind to the wolf who hides among them." He turned on his heel and strode out of the cabin. Abigail watched him mount his horse and ride away, a black figure shrinking against the vast landscape. The vulture's shadow had fallen over her home. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he would be back, and he would not be coming alone. The 2 days that followed Corbin Finch's visit were a torment of suspense. Abigail felt like a fly caught in a spider's web, watching the spider approach, knowing the final, fatal encounter was inevitable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of a hawk sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She couldn't eat. She barely slept, choosing instead to sit in her rocking chair, the rifle resting across her lap. Her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. Kyle watched her, his silent gaze missing nothing. He saw the new lines of strain around her mouth, the frantic way she paced the small cabin. He could not understand the words Finch had spoken, but he had understood the man's venomous tone, the triumphant glint in his eye as he'd held up the moccasin. He understood threat. He had lived with it his entire life. He tried once to gesture toward the door, then to himself, a question in his eyes. Was the man coming back for him? Abigail just shook her head, putting a finger to her lips. There was nothing to say, nothing to explain that he didn't already know. They were trapped together, two sides of a coin, bound by a shared, impending doom. A strange sense of solidarity began to grow in the suffocating silence. He was no longer just her secret, her patient, her enemy. He was her co-conspirator. The judgment of Cinder Creek arrived on the third day, just as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. They came not as a lynch mob with ropes and torches, but as something more insidious, a delegation of righteousness. Corbin Finch led the way, his face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. Beside him rode Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose perpetually worried expression seemed etched onto his face. The sheriff was a man who preferred paperwork to gun smoke, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. Behind them came the Reverend Michael, a stern, gaunt man who saw sin in every shadow, and a handful of other townsmen, ranchers and shopkeepers whose faces were hard and unforgiving. Abigail saw them coming from a long way, off a dark procession, kicking up a cloud of dust. "They're here," she said, her voice flat. She moved to the cot and looked down at Cale. There was nowhere to hide, no lie that would save them now. "Stay still. Don't move, no matter what." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not pride or defiance, but a flicker of raw fear, the fear of a helpless man about to be at the mercy of his enemies. He gave a single sharp nod. She opened the door before they could knock the rifle held loosely in her hand, its barrel pointed at the floor. She would not be seen cowering in her own home. "Mrs. Thorne." Sheriff Brody began dismounting heavily. He avoided her eyes, looking instead at the corner of her roof. "Mr. Finch here has made some troubling accusations. Mr. Finch is a liar and a thief who wants my land." Abigail said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror that was making her knees weak. Finch sneered from his horse. "The Lord sees all, Abigail, as does his humble servant. Sheriff, I demand you search this cabin." Sheriff Brody sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Abby, just tell me what's going on. Make this easy." "There is a man inside," she said, deciding that a partial truth was better than a futile lie. "He was hurt in the storm. I took him in. It was the Christian thing to do." "The Christian thing to do." The Reverend Michael boomed, his voice like cracking stone. He pointed a long, bony finger at her. "To give shelter to a heathen, a murderer. The Bible commands us to smite our enemies, woman not to nurse them at our hearth." Sheriff Finch pressed, "Do your duty." With a reluctant nod, Sheriff Brody stepped past Abigail into the cabin. The other men crowded in behind him, filling the small space with the scent of sweat leather and self-righteousness. It took them only a second to see him. Kyle lay on the cot, the blanket pulled up to his chest. He had pushed himself into a seated position, his back against the wall. He faced them not with the snarl of a cornered wolf, but with a stony, regal dignity that seemed to mock his own helplessness. His dark eyes moved from face to face, missing nothing, judging them in a silence more potent than any shouted threat. A collective gasp went through the men. He was real. The monster was real. And he was here, in the Widow Thorne's cabin. "Sweet Mother of God," one of the ranchers muttered his hand, going to the pistol at his hip. "Hold your fire, Orrin," the sheriff commanded, stepping between the men and the cot. He approached Cale cautiously. "Can you walk, son?" he asked. Cale's face remained a stone mask. Brody looked at his still legs, then at the way he was propped against the wall. He prodded one of Cale's thighs with the toe of his boot. There was no response. Brody looked back at Abigail, a glimmer of understanding, and perhaps pity in his eyes. "He's crippled." "A trick," Finch spat. "A savage's ruse to get close to gain her trust before he slits her throat in the night." "He can't move from the waist down," Abigail said, finding her voice again. "He fell from his horse, in the storm. I found him in the mud, dying. What was I supposed to do? What would any of you have done? We would have put a bullet in his head and saved the territory, the trouble." Orrin declared his statement, met with grunts of approval. "This is not just about harboring an enemy," the Reverend Michael proclaimed, stepping forward to loom over Abigail. His eyes burned with zealotry. "This is an abomination. For 10 days this woman has lived under the same roof as this male, unchaperoned. She has touched him, tended to his body. She has brought a deep and spiritual stain upon herself and this community. She has laid with the serpent." The air crackled with a new, uglier accusation. They weren't just angry, they were scandalized. Abigail felt a hot flush of shame and fury. "That is a vile lie. I am a God-fearing widow. I acted out of compassion. Your compassion has made you unclean," the Reverend pronounced. "You have broken the laws of God and man. You have chosen the company of a savage over your own people. You are corrupted." Corbin Finch saw his opening. He stepped forward, his expression one of grave, feigned concern. "Reverend Sheriff, this is a delicate situation. We cannot simply hang the man. He is a cripple, and we cannot cast out a widow, no matter how far she has fallen. There must be a way to contain the sin, to sanctify this unholy situation, and bring it under the watch of God and the law." Sheriff Brody looked from the paralyzed man on the cot to the defiant woman by the door, then to the angry faces of the townsmen. He was a man drowning in a situation far beyond his simple authority. "What are you suggesting, Corbin?" Finch's lips curved into a cruel, triumphant smile. "The Reverend spoke of an unholy union. So let us make it a holy one. She chose to lie with him, to care for him as a wife would. Let her be his wife then. Let them be married, bound together under our law. That way her sin is contained within a legal marriage, and the savage is bound to her, his keeper. He becomes her burden, her penance, a living reminder of her transgression for all to see." A shocked silence fell over the room. Abigail stared at him, horrified, unable to believe what she was hearing. It was a sentence worse than death, a life of public shame, chained to the man who was both her patient and a symbol of her ostracism. It was a brilliant, wicked solution that would punish her, neutralize the threat of the Apache, and leave her so thoroughly disgraced that she would eventually be forced to sell her land to the only man who would dare to associate with her Corbin Finch himself. The Reverend Michael stroked his chin, his severe face thoughtful. A perverse penance, but perhaps a fitting one, to bind the sinner to her sin. Yes, Yes, I see the Lord's justice in this. Abby, Sheriff Brody pleaded, his voice low. Don't make me do this. Sign over your land to Finch. Leave the territory. It's the only other way. Abigail looked at the faces surrounding her. Finch's smug triumph, the Reverend's righteous fury, the other men's fear and suspicion. Then she looked at the cot. Kyle had understood. She could see it in his eyes. The stony mask had finally cracked, replaced by disbelief and a dawning horror. They were going to chain him to this white woman, to this place for the rest of his life. To lose her land was to lose the last piece of William. To run was to admit a guilt she did not feel. To stay and fight seemed impossible. But in that moment, looking at their hateful, resolute faces, a cold, hard defiance settled deep in her soul. They wanted to break her. They wanted to see her grovel. She would not give them the satisfaction. She lifted her chin and looked directly at the sheriff, her voice ringing with bitter clarity in the silent cabin. You will need the Reverend, then. I will not sign away my home. The wedding was to take place immediately before any second thoughts or legal complexities could interfere. It was not to be a ceremony of celebration, but a ritual of judgment. The cabin, once Abigail's sanctuary, became her courtroom and her prison. The townsmen who had come with Finch and the sheriff stood as grim-faced witnesses, their presence a wall of condemnation. Reverend Michael produced a small, battered Bible from his saddlebags, its pages filled with his spidery, judgmental scrawls. He positioned himself before the hearth, turning the simple fireplace into a makeshift altar of damnation. Sheriff Brody, looking miserable, was tasked with being the legal authority. Abigail stood numbly, a cold, dead weight in the pit of her stomach. Her mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare, a fever dream born of grief and isolation. Yet the hard, accusing eyes of the men around her were real. The rough floorboards beneath her feet were real. The scent of rain-soaked wool and Finch's cloying bay rum cologne was suffocatingly real. Two of the men, Orrin and a farmer named Peterson, were ordered to move the groom. They approached the cot with a grim reluctance, as if handling a rattlesnake. Kyle offered no resistance. His face was devoid of all expression, a terrifying blankness that was worse than any rage. He had retreated deep within himself to a place they could not touch. They lifted him, his useless legs dangling, and half-carried, half-dragged him to the center of the room, propping him up against a wooden chair, so that he was in a seated position before the altar. His eyes, dark pools of silent fury, were fixed on a point on the far wall, refusing to acknowledge anyone. "We will begin," the Reverend Michael announced, his voice echoing in the small space. He opened his Bible, his bony finger tracing a passage. "Marriage is a holy institution, ordained by God to join a man and a woman in righteous union, to prevent the sin of fornication, and to provide for the lawful procreation of children. Though the circumstances here are irregular, the sacrament must be observed." Each word was a lash. He was deliberately framing the ceremony as a cure for her perceived sin, cementing the narrative that she was a wanton woman who had bedded a savage. Abigail felt a hot tear of pure rage trace a path down her cheek, but she quickly brushed it away. She would not weep for them. "Abigail Thorne," the Reverend intoned, his gaze boring into her. "Do you come here of your own free will?" The question was a mockery. Her free will had been stripped from her the moment Finch had ridden away with her moccasin. She looked at Corbin Finch, who was watching her with an expression of smug victory. She looked at Sheriff Brody, who refused to meet her gaze. She looked at the hard, closed faces of her neighbors. Her free will was to accept this public damnation or be cast out with nothing her name and her husband's memory forever stained by lies. "I do," she whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. The Reverend turned his attention to Cale. "And you," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "Cale, is that your name?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Do you take this woman Abigail Thorne to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Kyle remained silent, his gaze unwavering from the wall. He would not participate in his own humiliation. "He does not speak our tongue, Reverend," Finch interjected smoothly. "But his presence here is his consent. He is in no position to object." The Reverend grunted, accepting the explanation. "Very well. The savage's silence will be taken as assent." He launched into the vows, his voice a droning monotone that robbed the sacred words of all their meaning. "Do you, Abigail, take this man to be your husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, till death do you part, in sickness?" The irony was a knife twisting in her gut. His entire existence in her life was sickness. The vows were meant to be a promise of devotion, but here they were, a sentence of lifelong servitude. She was being bound not just to a man, but to his paralysis, to his otherness, to the town's unending hatred. She had to force the words from her throat. "I do." "And do you," he said, turning back to the silent, seated figure, "take this woman to be your wife?" He paused for a beat. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Arizona, I take your silence as a vow before the Almighty." There were no rings. There was no kiss. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. "It is done," the Reverend declared, snapping his Bible shut. "What God has joined together in this irregular fashion, let no man put asunder. You are man and wife. Sheriff, you may make out the certificate." Sheriff Brody trudged to Abigail's small writing desk and began scratching out the official document with a heavy hand. Abigail felt dizzy, disembodied. She was Mrs. Abigail Thorne no more. She was something else. A name she didn't know, linked to a man she didn't know. Orrin and Peterson moved Kyle from the chair and deposited him unceremoniously back on the cot. He landed with a soft thud, the sound sickeningly final. Corbin Finch was the first to approach her. "My condolences, Mrs. He let the name hang, a final, deliberate insult. "On your new situation, remember my offer still stands. When the burden becomes too great, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat and walked out, his victory complete. One by one, the other men filed out, none of them meeting her eyes. They had participated in her ritual shaming, and now they were eager to be away from the scene of the crime. The last to leave were the sheriff and the Reverend. "The certificate is on the desk," Brody mumbled, his face flushed. "It's legal." The Reverend paused at the door, fixing Abigail with one last hard look. "You will live with your choice, woman. Let your shame be a lesson to this community. May God have mercy on your stained soul." Then they were gone. The door swung shut, leaving Abigail alone in the silent cabin with her new husband. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, a coyote yelped in the twilight. The world went on, oblivious to the fact that hers had just been irrevocably shattered. She sank into her rocking chair, the rifle still in her hand, and stared at the man on the cot. He had finally turned his head and was looking at her. The blankness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a complex storm of emotions she could not begin to decipher, rage, humiliation, and a deep, burning resentment that was directed entirely at her. She was his savior, his nurse, his jailer, and now his wife. In his eyes, she was the architect of this entire catastrophe. The fragile, unspoken truce they had shared was gone, burned to ash in the fire of the unholy sacrament. They were no longer patient and healer. They were prisoner and guard bound together in a cage built of lies and sanctified by law. The days that followed the wedding were heavier and more silent than any that had come before. The cabin, already small, seemed to shrink further, its walls pressing in on them thick with resentment. Abigail felt like a ghost in her own home. She cooked, cleaned, and tended to the small garden, her movements mechanical, her mind a numb fog of disbelief. She was a wife again. The thought was so absurd, so grotesque, that she would sometimes stop in the middle of a task, her breath catching in her throat. Her name was no longer her own. When she made her weekly trip to Cinder Creek for supplies, the change was immediate and brutal. She had always been Mrs. Thorne, or Abigail, a respected, if pitied, member of the community. Now she was met with averted eyes and hurried whispers. Martha Jennings, a woman who had often shared tea with her, crossed the street to avoid her. At the mercantile Finch's Mercantile, she was served with a cold, grudging slowness. Finch himself watched her from his office, a smirk playing on his lips. She was no longer a person. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale, the Apache's wife. The shame was a physical weight bowing her shoulders, but beneath it, a hard, stubborn anger began to solidify. They had done this to her. They had twisted her compassion into a crime and sentenced her to this life. She would not break. She would endure. Back at the cabin, the silence with Kyle was a weapon. He refused to look at her, turning his face to the wall whenever she approached. He would accept the food she gave him, but his movements were stiff with anger. He was a captive not just in his body, but in this life she had, in his eyes, forced upon him. The shared vulnerability that had once been a fragile bridge between them had been replaced by a chasm of blame. One afternoon, her frustration boiled over. She had spent hours trying to rig a pulley system so he could lift his own torso to give him some small measure of independence. After she had finished, she stood back, proud of her work. "There," she said, her voice raw. "That should help." He stared at the rope and wood contraption with cold contempt, and then deliberately turned his back on it. Something inside Abigail snapped. "Fine, don't use it. Lie there and hate me. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose this life? They did this to us. That man Finch, the others, they trapped us. Both of us." She was speaking English, and she knew he wouldn't understand the words, but the torrent of emotion, the sheer force of her despair, broke through the barrier of language. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with hers. For the first time, he saw past his own humiliation and saw hers. He saw the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks, the tremor in her hands. He saw that she was as much a prisoner as he was. The anger in his eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of grudging comprehension. He reached out and, with a deliberate, powerful motion, pulled on the rope she had made. He lifted himself an inch off the cot, then lowered himself back down. It was a small movement, but it was an acknowledgement, an armistice. From that day on, the ice began to thaw. The silence remained, but it was no longer hostile. It became a shared space of observation. He watched her hands as she kneaded bread or stitched a patch onto her dress. She watched him as he used the pulley to exercise his arms, his torso muscles cording with effort. He was fighting silently and stubbornly to reclaim what little control he could over his own body. One evening, as she sat cleaning her rifle, he made a small gesture with his hand, mimicking the cleaning motion, and then pointed to himself. It was a question. She hesitated for a moment, then slid the heavy gun and the cleaning kit across the floor to him. He took it his movements economical and expert. He disassembled the weapon with a familiarity that told her he had spent his life with tools of war. As he worked, she saw not a savage, but a man with skills, with knowledge, with a past. They began to communicate through gestures and a handful of shared words. Water. Food. Pain. He would point to the herbs she kept hanging from the rafters, and she would tell him their names. He would watch the sky and trace the path of a hawk with his finger, a silent sharing of a moment of beauty. A month into their strange marriage, something shifted. Abigail was changing his bandages when she noticed a faint tremor in the calf of his right leg. It was barely perceptible, a flicker of life in a limb that had been dead to the world. She froze her fingers, hovering over his skin. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. He looked down, his expression unreadable, and slowly, deliberately concentrated. The muscle twitched again, stronger this time. A jolt like lightning passed through the room. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a miracle, but it was something. It was hope, a secret. It became their first shared secret, a powerful bond forged in the face of utter despair. They didn't speak of it, but it was there between them. In the weeks that followed, the twitches became more frequent, spreading to his other leg. He began a new grueling regimen, secretly working the muscles, pushing against the paralysis with a will of iron. Abigail would help massaging his legs with liniment until her hands ached her touch, no longer that of a clinical nurse, but something more. They were partners now, allied against the fate that had been forced upon them. One night she awoke to a strange sound. She sat up, clutching her blanket. Kyle was off his cot. He was on the floor, his back braced against the wooden frame, sweat beading on his forehead in the moonlight. Using only his arms and the incredible strength of his torso, he had dragged himself to the center of the room. With a guttural cry of pure, agonizing effort, he pushed against the floor, trying to force his legs to obey. Abigail scrambled out of her bed and rushed to his side. "You'll hurt yourself!" He ignored her, his face a mask of concentration. He pushed again, his whole body trembling. She saw it then, his toes. His toes on his left foot had curled just slightly, gripping the floorboard. He collapsed back, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not triumph, but the dawning of a terrifying, dangerous possibility. He was healing. Slowly, painstakingly, life was returning to his limbs. And they both knew, with chilling certainty, that if anyone in Cinder Creek found out, if Corbin Finch ever learned that the helpless cripple he had used to ruin her life was a cripple no more, he would not send a preacher and a sheriff. He would send men with guns. Their secret was no longer just a hope. It was a death sentence. The secret of Cale's recovery transformed the cabin into a tinderbox of hope and fear. His progress was painstakingly slow, measured first in tremors, then in agonizing steps. The afternoon, Abigail found him standing, legs trembling violently, but holding his own weight was a moment of breathtaking triumph, quickly soured by terror. A man who could stand, could be seen, and they both knew Finch's patience wouldn't last. It ran out at dusk. Corbin Finch arrived with 2 armed men, his face a mask of malicious purpose. He burst through the door and stopped, his eyes widening, as he saw Cale standing defiantly. "Well, well, a miracle," Finch sneered, raising his rifle. "It seems our savage has found his legs, an infestation we're here to cleanse." But Abigail was faster. She fired not at Finch, but at the hanging lantern, shattering it, and plunging the room into a chaos of firelight and shadow. Kyle threw the heavy hearth poker, striking one man, as Abigail's next shot wounded the other. In the confusion, Finch lunged, knocking the rifle from her grasp. He pinned her to the floor, his face a mask of rage. Just as he raised his rifle to deliver a final blow, Kyle launched himself from the hearth. With a warrior's cry, he tackled Finch, a desperate act of will and recovering strength. They crashed to the floor as the cabin door flew open. Sheriff Brody stood framed in the doorway, drawn by the shots. He saw the scene not as Finch would tell it, but for what it was, a vicious attack. "Drop it, Corbin," Brody commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over." The truth, once revealed, could not be unseen. Corbin Finch and his men were arrested, and as they were treated for their wounds by Doc Hemlock, the full story of Finch's greed and manipulation came out. Cinder Creek was forced to look at its own reflection, and it did not like what it saw. They had been so blinded by fear and prejudice that they had allowed a wolf to lead them. There were apologies, of course, awkward, mumbled words from people who now saw Abigail not as a traitor, but as a victim who had fought back. But the apologies could not erase the shaming, nor could they change the certificate filed in the town hall. Abigail and Cale were still man and wife, but their world had changed. The threat was gone, but the scars remained. They were no longer outcasts to be feared, but they would never truly belong. Their story was too strange, their union too controversial. One cool morning, a month after the fight, they packed a mule with what little they owned. Cale, now able to walk with the help of a sturdy cane, stood beside her. He was still a long way from the warrior he had once been, but he was no longer a prisoner. They looked at the small cabin one last time, a place of terror and salvation, and turned west toward the setting sun and an unknown future. They were a strange pair, a settler widow and a recovering Apache warrior, bound not by law or religion, but by a shared crucible of survival respect, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that was more powerful than any vow. If their journey from enemies to allies, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of hatred, has captured your imagination, please help us share it. Click the like button, share this video with fellow lovers of history and drama, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the wild heart of the West. Your support allows these echoes of the past to be heard. Thank you for listening.